Dear listeners, welcome to our video program of the Social Research Center of the Republic of Azerbaijan. This is the premier platform for insightful discussions on pressing geopolitical matters, and I am your host, Pasha Bayramov, senior researcher of the Social Research Center. And it is with great pleasure that I extend warm welcome to our distinguished guest today, Mr. Stephen Pifer, an eminent expert in international affairs and former US ambassador to Ukraine. This is our sixth video program and the first program of 2024. We should remind you that the research article to be written at the end of the program will be published in the important newspapers of the country. And we want to thank our guest, Stephen Pifer, for his time in the first program of the year. So, without further ado, let us navigate the intricacies of our first question. In light of recent developments, Ukraine facing challenges in regions like Bakhmut, Avdiivka, has encountered significant hurdles in its ongoing struggle. From a geopolitical standpoint, Mr. Pifer, on the Russo-Ukrainian war, what outcomes do you anticipate in the unfolding political landscape throughout the coming year?
Yeah, well, first let me challenge a narrative which I think is taking hold now that Ukraine somehow is losing the war. I mean, I don't think that you can say that Ukraine is winning. The counteroffensive did not succeed as many of us had hoped. But if you look in January of 2024, how much Ukrainian territory that the Russian military occupies, it's not much more than what they occupied in January of 2023. And it's a lot less than the Russian military occupied in June of 2022. The Ukrainians, though, now have gone over to a defensive fight. And what we've seen in the last year and a half is that defense has certain advantages. So I think the war is going to drag on for some time. There will be small gains here and there, but it's still, I think, difficult at this point to see the Russians making a major breakthrough that would end the war. And I think you see in Ukraine a determination to keep on fighting. The big question to my mind right now is there is no shortage of what Ukrainian determination. The question is Ukraine's ability to continue the fight, and will the West continue the flow of weapons to Ukraine that the Ukrainians so desperately need?
Yes. Some people say that war can take a bit time also. I have talked with European experts on this issue, and some say that it could take 1 or 2 more years. Do you agree with that?
I think it could go on for some time to come. It's very difficult to see at this point that the Russians, given their performance of the last 2 years, making a major breakthrough that would end the war. I think while it's not impossible, the Ukrainians will have to think about, and they'll have to take some time to regroup for another offensive operation. So it's a situation where I think the fighting is going to continue, but perhaps the most likely scenario for the next, say, 6 to 9 months is fighting continue with neither side in a position to make the decisive breakthrough that really brings the war to an end.
Do you foresee a harmonious consensus between the United States and European Union regarding their stance on Ukraine in the foreseeable future? The repercussions of this conflict have notably impacted especially Eastern European nations, because supporting a war puts a lot of damage on the economy also. Because right now Eastern European countries, especially them, are facing with economic challenges because of this war. Do you see any further kind of a problems between the United States and the European Union in the stance of the war?
Well, I'd make 2 observations. The first observation is if you look at the Europeans, those countries in Central and Eastern Europe, Poland, the Baltic states, Romania, those seem to be the countries that are most committed to supporting Ukraine.
Exactly, yes.
And I think it's because of their proximity to Russia. They recognize that the threat to their own security increases should Russia prevail in Ukraine. My second observation would be, I think there's actually a fairly good unity of views between the United States and Europe. There are a couple of outliers, for example, Hungary. But I think if you look at the unity between the United States and Europe, it's much more, and it's better than people might have predicted, say, in February of 2022.
Mhm.
You have a situation now where, in fact, Europe actually is providing more assistance to Ukraine than the United States. I think if you look at just military assistance, Europe's provided slightly more. But if you look at additional financial assistance, Europe has provided considerably more assistance. And that suggests to me that Europe recognizes that they have a vital interest in how this war plays out. So my concern at the moment is, really the United States, does the question of support Ukraine get caught up in domestic politics? I still think that there's a good chance that the Congress will vote through a significant additional support for Ukraine, but I'm more concerned about that possibility than I was, say, 3 or 4 months ago.
But what about the Western Europe, though? Do you think they are on the same page with Eastern Europeans?
Yeah, I think if you look at the Germans, the
Yeah.
French, and the British, I mean, they may not see this threat in Germany and in France in quite the same stark terms as they do in Poland and the Baltic states. But you also see, I think the Germans have now pledged a significant amount of money. I think it's like $8 billion in military assistance
Yeah.
in 2024. The British are continuing to provide assistance. So yeah, I'm certain there are regional differences within Europe. But thus far, Europe, with the exception of a couple of outliers, again, I would single out Hungary in this regard, seems to understand that Europe has a vital stake in how this war between Russia and Ukraine turns out.
Mr. Pifer, as a US diplomat, I would like to ask you about on our region also. In the hypothetical scenario where Russia achieves increased influence by consolidating power on the war and forming alliances with other nations, it's a hypothetical scenario, but still, do you foresee the potential emergence of a new Cold War period? Or let's say, how might such a geopolitical shift impact international relations, particularly involving the United States?
Yeah, I mean, it does seem to me, I don't like to use the term Cold War
Yeah,
because I think, the Cold War was a very different struggle. I mean, it was a political, military, economic, ideological struggle.
yeah.
Um, and it was very different in at the time you had the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. Basically, every member of the Warsaw Pact that wasn't part of the Soviet Union and is now a member of NATO, plus you have the three Baltic states, which are members of NATO. Plus, because of Russia's assault on Ukraine, Finland and Sweden have decided to abandon neutrality and applied to join NATO back in 2022. So I just think it's a very different structure if you look at, for example, the economies of the United States and European countries and compared to Russia, it's 15 times larger than Russia. So it's not quite a Cold War competition. Now, having said that, it's also pretty clear that relations between the United States and Russia, between the West and Russia, are at their lowest point in decades. And it's very difficult to see how we move beyond that while Russia is continuing to prosecute this neo-imperialist war against Ukraine.
Exactly. Uh, if it's possible, I would like to hear from you about South Caucasus and Azerbaijan also, like considering Azerbaijan's recent resolution of the Nagorno-Karabakh issue and restoration of its internationally recognized borders. How do you envision the geopolitical implications for the region and beyond, maybe on the perspective of the United States or not?
Yeah, well, I think that's an area that's just a bit beyond outside my lane of expertise.
Yeah, of course, of course.
I think the U.S. Would like to see a stable situation in the Caucasus, but certainly in looking at the post-Soviet space, the focus now very much is on Russia, Ukraine. I think one of the things that we have seen is that my guess is, had it not been for Russia's February 22 all-out attack on Ukraine, Russia might have been a more active player in trying to resolve the fighting between Azerbaijan and Armenia.
Exactly.
But we're now seeing, I think, that Russia's ability to act within the post-Soviet space an area where I think the Russians would like to have a sphere of influence, although I think that that's an outmoded concept. But the Russians, by virtue of their action against Ukraine, have actually reduced their ability to act elsewhere in the area.
Exactly. I would like to ask a final question, if it's possible. Despite Azerbaijan's efforts to ensure the return of Armenians to Karabakh within the framework of international law, of course, concerns about ethnic cleansing persist in the West. Still, it exists. But from a diplomatic standpoint, given the steps taken by Azerbaijan and its adherence to legal norms in the resolution of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, do you believe there is a potential for a positive relations between Azerbaijan and the Western nations in the upcoming period? And how might these diplomatic ties contribute to regional stability? As you mentioned concerning that Russia is also wants to feel its power on the region also.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think to the extent that that ethnic cleansing can be avoided, that makes it easier for relations between the West and Azerbaijan. I mean, Azerbaijan clearly has won the military victory. I think to the extent that Azerbaijan is seen as magnanimous in that victory, that may make it easier in terms of Azerbaijan's relations with the West. But again, this is an area that I haven't really been focusing on. The Russia-Ukraine conflict has consumed most of my attention for the last 18 months.
And I already on social media accounts of Russian Telegram channels, we see that some movements across the border into Avdiivka or other little towns. But do you think these are actually like achievement? Because we only see like 1 or 2 kilometers beyond and then back again. Nothing, it seems like nothing changes on the border.
No, I think that's right. I mean, I think the Russians may make a little bit of progress in Avdiivka or maybe in Marinka, but it seems to me that the progress there, it's like if you look at over the course of the last year, what could the Russians call their biggest victory? And I think they would say it was taking Bakhmut in May.
Yeah. It was Kherson back then,
but a couple of things to remember. First of all, Bakhmut had very little strategic importance. Taking Bakhmut probably cost the Russians tens of thousands of lives. My own view is that the Ukrainians probably held on to Bakhmut because they calculated correctly that they could inflict massive calculations on the Russian invaders. So to my mind, Bakhmut is the epitome of a Pyrrhic victory. It was a victory that probably was not worth it in terms of cost to the Russians. But you may have now, I mean, the Russians have a presidential election. I put that in quotation marks because I don't think there's any doubt about who will be president of Russia after the March 17 ballot is conducted. But I think there is some pressure on the Russian military to achieve some victories to show that they're having momentum in the run-up to that election. But again, I don't think any Western military analysts are saying that what the Russians are doing around Marinka or Avdiivka is some major breakthrough. They've taken a kilometer, they've destroyed a town, but it's not going to be a development that has fundamentally affects the course of the war.
And finally, my last question will be, do you think that there could have been a scenario that, on the perspective of Ukraine, it's understandable because Russia started the war, but do you think that this war could have been avoidable on some perspective? Maybe Russia could have avoided, but on the perspective of Ukraine, is there any scenario that Ukraine could have avoided this situation?
I think it would have been hard for Ukraine. I mean, Ukrainians did not want this war.
Exactly. Yes.
Bear in mind, when Russia seized Crimea back in 2014, the Ukrainians had about 10,000 troops on the peninsula. They kept those troops in garrison. They chose not to fight. They wanted to avoid a war. When it became Donbass, I think they concluded they had to fight. But it seems to me that there were really 3 reasons why we saw this massive invasion in February of 2022. One was a concern on the part of the Kremlin that Ukraine was moving away from Russia. It was moving out of Russia's sphere of influence. Now, the irony here is nothing has done more than Russian policy of the past 11 years to push Ukraine away from Russia and towards the West, going back to the seizure of Crimea. A second factor, I think, behind this is the Kremlin. It was about domestic politics in Russia. And that is for the Kremlin, a stable, democratic, Western-oriented Ukraine with a growing market economy, that's a nightmare. Because that kind of Ukraine causes the Russian people to ask why they can't have the same democratic rights, the same political voice that Ukrainians do. But the third factor, I think the most important factor here, is Vladimir Putin. I'm not sure you would have seen this invasion had there been any other leader in the Kremlin, but look at the way Vladimir Putin talks. He fundamentally does not accept the right of Ukraine and Ukrainians to exist as a sovereign and independent nation. When he talks about Ukraine, he talks about recovering historic Russian lands. This, in a way, it really is, it's a neo-imperialist war. It's Vladimir Putin trying to restore parts of the Russian Empire that were lost when the Soviet Union collapsed back in 1991. And again, I think given those factors, I'm not sure that the Ukrainians could have done anything that would have avoided this war. The demands that the Russians have amount to total capitulation, and it would have been a surprise to me that any Ukrainian government could have accepted those.
Thank you so much, Mr. Pifer. And I would like to express our heartfelt wishes for a healthy and prosperous new year to you from us. Thank you so much for your time. It was a
Thank you, and
pleasant
happy
meeting.
New Year to you as well.
Thank you a lot.